Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mina and today's video is going to be my top 5 favorite Stephen King books that I've read so far. So I put up a poll on my Instagram story a couple of days ago. If you are not following me on there, make sure you go ahead and check out my Instagram. It is Book Skywalker. I link that below in the description in every video. So a couple of days ago, I put up a poll on my Instagram story asking if you guys would be interested in seeing this video first or my summer thriller recommendation video first, and actually more people chose the summer thriller video. However, I am going to wait to do that one because I'm currently reading a book that I may add to that list, so I wanted to wait until I finished reading that before I film that video. If you guys don't know this, Stephen King is one of my favorite authors. I am a huge fan of his novels. I love horror, as you guys know, and Stephen King is like the master of horror, and I know many people who also like the genre are Stephen King fans as well. So I'm always interested in hearing what are other people's favorite Stephen King books and which ones do they not like. So for today's video, I'm going to give you my top 5, and I haven't read every Stephen King book out there. There are so many of them, there's like 50, but I have read a good amount, I think like 11 total. So I'm just going to give you so far my top 5 list as of now, and of course if I read other Stephen Kings in the future, I can update this list with any new favorites that I come across. So I'm also going to put this video in order from my least favorite book to my number 1 Stephen King book. So we're gonna start with number 5, and my number 5 Stephen King book is The Outsider, and this is actually one of his more recent novels. This actually came out in 2018, so very recent, and this book took me a little while to get into. It is quite a thick book, but there are a lot of things that I really enjoy about this. If you're not familiar with the premise of this book, it is about this very small town where everybody knows each other, and one day a little boy is found murdered and his body is abused and tortured in the woods, and the evidence on the boy's body suggests that the murderer is the small town baseball coach. Everybody knows this baseball coach. He's one of the most beloved people in the town, so it's a bit of a shock for everybody to find that out. However, throughout the story, there's some conflicting evidence that shows that maybe it wasn't the baseball coach. So it's kind of a mix between like a detective mystery, procedural type story, and also a horror. There's also a really interesting mix of questioning whether or not this story is supernatural, and we do see some of those elements throughout the book, and that question is answered towards the end of the book. And I just really enjoyed the way that this was told. We had many different perspectives, from the detective to the coach to the family members of the boy who was murdered, to some of the other town people who were involved within the case and who are related to or know some of the other characters that are involved in the case. So it is a very complex kind of story, and I did really appreciate that mix of detective mystery and horror as well, which is why this is one of my favorites. I think the characters are great in here, and I think that the overall story dealing with this idea of like a legendary kind of villain is really interesting. So this is one of my favorite of his newer books. I don't really pick up a lot of Stephen King's newer novels because I'm trying to read more of like his classics, but in terms of a newer release, this one is definitely one of my favorites. My number 4 favorite Stephen King book is Misery, and this is one of his more classic novels. If you're not familiar with the story of Misery, this is about a writer who gets into a very serious car accident in the middle of a snowstorm, and the woman who comes to rescue him and who eventually cares for him claims to be his number 1 fan. And it quickly becomes a very dark novel because the woman who is his number 1 fan ends up holding him hostage within her home, and she is keeping him there until he can rewrite one of the novels where she didn't like the ending to the book. So that's the overall premise of this, but basically it's just about the writer trying to survive the woman holding him hostage and trying to escape from her as well. And it's such an interesting and suspenseful story, which is why I really like this one. Again, Stephen King is great at writing characters, so the character of Annie, who is the villain in this book, is very well done. Her character is super interesting because she's not like a typical villain. You wouldn't expect someone like her to be evil or to be bad. She seems like a very like happy, almost friendly neighbor-like character, but she has a very dark side. But it is definitely one of my favorites. It kept me on the edge of my seat. There is some gore, there is some violence in this, which is why I think this is categorized as horror, but it is also quite psychological. We are in the author's head a lot, him going over schemes and plans to try to escape from Annie, and like I said, super suspenseful and keeping you on the edge of your seat. Definitely like a page turner, so I would probably recommend this to someone who is not really familiar with Stephen King or who hasn't read any of his novels. I think this would be a good place to start. It's not overly scary and it's not super long, so definitely recommend Misery. Coming in at number 3 on my favorite Stephen King list is The Shining, and everybody knows what The Shining is. If you haven't read the book, you've probably seen the movie, and I do want to say that I love the movie, even though the book and the movie are completely different, and some people think that if you like one, you can't like the other, and Stephen King hates the movie himself, but kind of just look at them as like two separate entities, and I appreciate both of them. I absolutely love The Shining book for a couple of different reasons. This was one of the first Stephen King books that I actually picked up, and again, it is quite lengthy, a little bit less than 500 pages, but this is the story of Jack Torrance, who takes a job at the Overlook Hotel. Him and his family go up there during the off season, and they are asked to look after the hotel while nobody is staying there, and it quickly becomes extremely creepy because there are some supernatural, mysterious things going on within the hotel, and Jack Torrance himself also starts to go a little bit mad, starts to get a little bit of cabin fever and go kind of crazy. So we're dealing with his mental state as well as some of the supernatural elements that are going on within the hotel. You also have the character of his son, Danny, who has this supernatural ability where he is able to see and kind of communicate with dead people or ghosts. So there are a few different layers going on in this book, which make it really complex and really interesting. I liked that this one had spooky, creepy horror elements that some of his other books don't have. I liked that this one had a lot of character, I don't know if I would say development, but there's definitely a lot of character building in here. We get a lot of Jack's past, we get a lot of his wife, a lot of his son, and a lot of information about the Overlook Hotel itself, which kind of acts like its own character in a way. So this is just one of my favorite novels because of how much effort and dedication Stephen King took to write this book. I think that I just really enjoyed this one because it's so well known and because it is one of his creepiest novels. Number 2 on my list of favorite Stephen King novels is Pet Sematary, which is also another classic Stephen King novel that turned into a film. I read this one a little bit more recently than the others. This one I read at the beginning of 2019, and the reason why I read it was because there was a new film adaptation coming out, which I still haven't seen, but that's why I decided to read this one and pick this one up. And Pet Sematary is about a family that moves into this new home, and the father and his daughter are introduced to this woodland area behind their home, and past all of the woods they come across this area known as the Pet Cemetery, where all of the local kids used to bury their dead pets. So I'm not going to really say anything more than that, just because that was all I knew going into this story, and I think it's better if you just know that much. But one thing that I liked about this book is that it is very emotional, it's very family oriented, and there is a lot of like family drama kind of going on alongside some of the horror elements. So I like that this one had a little bit more heart, a little bit more emotion, and it deals a lot with the themes of grief and dealing with death, and I think that makes it a much more meaningful horror novel, which is why I really enjoyed this one. This one also dealt with that idea of a legend, and there is a lot of mention of like the past and things being buried within the cemetery for years. So I think that that layer also made it quite interesting for me as well. And it was super creepy. Like I actually found this one unsettling in certain ways, which is why I appreciate this one. Sometimes I'm not afraid of Stephen King novels and I just enjoy reading them, but I'm not actually creeped out. But I feel like Pet Sematary definitely delivers some good creepy scares and some good good creepy moments. So if you're looking for something unsettling and a little bit creepier than some of his other works, I would definitely recommend this one. And lastly, my number one all-time favorite Stephen King novel is, of course, It. So not only is It my favorite Stephen King novel of all time, but it is also one of my all-time favorite books in general. I read this book a long time ago, and it actually took me about a month to get through it. It is probably the longest book that I've ever read. It comes at about 1,100 pages. So it is a huge, huge novel. And the reason why this one is my favorite is definitely because it feels like an entire lifetime when you read through this. You're following the perspective of a group of boys when they are young in the 50s. They're about like 11 or 12 years old. And then also you follow them as adults in the 80s, and in their small town there is this entity known as It, who disguises himself as a clown, and he comes back every 27 years to feed off of the children of Derry, Maine. And this group of boys encounters this monster, and they try to defeat him when they're young kids in the 50s, and they realize that they don't end up killing him, so they return later on in the 80s as adults to try and defeat him once and for all. And this book is so much more than just like a horror novel, which is why it's so brilliant to me. I feel like just like Pet Sematary, there is a lot of emotion, there's a lot of grief. We follow the boys' lives as children and into adults, and we really see their struggles with their families, with their relationships, with their jobs, and the different things that they are facing in their lives. So it is quite exhaustive of a novel, and it really makes you feel, like I said, as if you've lived through 7 different lifetimes, because you are going through 7 different characters throughout the book. And you can see by how big it is, Stephen King does not leave out any details, and he really gets into the characters' minds and their struggles and their lives. I don't know, it's just such a fascinating read. There are definitely some freaky moments in here that I was creeped out by, so not only is it a good drama type novel, but it's also a good horror novel because of those creepy moments throughout the book. I'm not going to address some of the controversial issues with this book because obviously I have the same opinion as everybody else. There's certain scenes that I do not agree with. There are certain choices that Stephen King made while writing this book that I think should not be in here. However, I'm not going to let that take away from my enjoyment of this book because it is so long and because there's so many good things about it. I feel like I can just eliminate certain things and kind of not think about them when I'm thinking about this book. So yeah, it is definitely my all-time favorite of his. I would totally recommend this to anybody. However, I would not recommend this as your first Stephen King novel. I think it's better to go to some of his shorter and more palatable novels before you pick this one up, just because I feel like if anybody were to pick this up as their first one, they probably wouldn't read any other Stephen King books. But once you kind of get used to his writing style and how much detail he gives, sometimes he goes off in tangents and you're like, where is this going? Does this have to deal with the plot? Probably not, but I definitely do appreciate that of him as a writer because I think it takes a lot of dedication and a lot of effort to really include enough detail to make your characters seem realistic, and that's definitely something that he does in this book. And I also just enjoyed this book because of the friendship between the group of kids and how close they are to one another and how much they care about each other, and it just feels like real life to me. I think that a lot of this book talks about things that everybody struggles with, like bullying, abuse, difficult family relationships, anxiety, depression, or things like that. Those are all very real struggles and fears that people have on a daily basis, and so I appreciate this novel because it touches upon those different things and it makes it so much more complex and meaningful in my opinion. So those were my top 5 Stephen King novels at the moment, but I'm really interested to hear what are some of your favorite Stephen King novels. I know everybody has a completely different list, and since I haven't read everything, I'm sure people have favorites that I haven't even read yet, which is always exciting to hear. Let me know in the comments below which ones are your favorites. You share any of my favorites as well. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day today. Bye guys!